much of my work in the lives of others is essentially about relationship, and it is about how we can have harmonious relationships. And of course, in that, I have worked a lot with conflict in relationship. So I thought it would be useful today to talk about that and about how to heal and resolve conflict in our relationships. And I think one of the very first places to really start to heal that is to have it as a recognition that if there's conflict, there is growth wanting to happen. In that conflict, there is always that opportunity. There is always an opportunity for some transformation and some growth and some resolution, because the conflict that's come up it's inevitably, it looks like it's come up in the space between us, which it has, but of course it's arisen out of the conflict within each person. And at the deepest level, really and truly, one person in healing their conflict within them can do a huge amount to heal a conflict in the relationships with others. And therefore, if there are two people in conflict and both are committed to resolving it, then it makes it even more. Of course, it doubles and multiplies the opportunities. But even if the other person isn't in the place of being able to reflect or look at themselves, one person can make a massive difference. Because really and truly, within conflict, what's happening is somebody wants something one way and somebody wants something the other way. There is a difference of how things need to be done. Now, that doesn't need to lead to conflict. That can be a creative dialogue where opportunities and validating the differences of the other person's ideas and opinions and views leads to something co-created that's bigger. The difficulties arise when somebody's wounds get hurt, yes, but get touched, because what happens is if somebody receives the other person's words as criticism, or that they're not being valued, or they're not being heard, or they're not being seen, then immediately not in the present moment. Immediately they're not in the actual situation of what really is being discussed. They are back. They can be 90% in the past, back in the feeling of lack of validation when they were little, when in their family home where they perhaps were criticised and not understood and not seen and not heard, and all the things that go on when we're little, school, all these places where there's a loss of confidence of knowing who you truly are. And so then at the core of it, it's also really and truly not feeling lovable or loved. And then what starts to happen is that the inner child wants the other person to make it better. They want it to be the other person's fault, and they start to put their resolution in the hands of the other. And of course then there's a spiral downwards, and everything goes wrong. And if two people are going that, it can be so painful. And of course that happens a lot, and it goes more and more and into a pit, and sometimes never resolves. And there are people who will have continual conflicts like that, and it kind of chips away at the safety of the space between them, and it chips away at love, or they just get used to it and it just live in a kind of power struggle, and it lowers the vibration, and it doesn't enhance the energy around or each person. So any conflict and any feeling of an attack, so if we feel we've had an attack or a criticism or whatever from the other person, and often that's very valid, we may well have had that happen. Actually, anything that internal or external, it's all the same thing, because it's all coming within us. Because when we are able to start to heal our own wounds and understand our own triggers, and understand when somebody says something and what we hear may not be what they've said. They may have said something, they want us to change something, or they want us to do something differently, or they want to talk about an issue or create something together. And what we might have heard is, I'm not good enough, I'm not loved, I'm not heard, I'm not listened to. And the moment that's been triggered, we can't hear the actual words and we're not present. And therefore that's where the conflict starts to spiral downwards. Whereas if we're willing to, any single time in any dialogue and any relationship, when we'll feel a trigger, and when I say a trigger, when we'll feel reactive, when we feel upset, angry, hurt, if we can have the presence not to act out of that and not to be immediately defensive or withdraw or have a tone in our voice, if we start to practice that, everything can start to change. Because something I'll often say is that when we're pointing a finger at someone and saying, you know, you haven't heard me, you haven't listened to me, you're criticizing me, there are these three fingers that are pointing back at us. And therefore we need actually, we need actually to examine what these three fingers are. That's more, it's bigger than the finger we're pointing at the other. So if we're willing to at least start to investigate that and start to notice where conflict arises, because it can be small things. We can feel reactive quickly and get defensive or withdraw from somebody or criticize them back. And all these conflicts are all coming from something within us. So if we can start to recognize, and again, I always come back to the core of the work is clearing our reactivity. If we can come back to the point where we feel upset, we feel angry, we feel hurt, we immediately press pause, and we need to manage our tone of voice. That makes a massive, massive difference. We need to be self-aware enough to manage the tone in our voice and to respond with, you know, calm, equanimity, kindness. We also need to really recognize that what we've heard may not be what they were saying. So this is where mirroring back what we've heard is very important, and just saying, oh, so what you said was that you'd like me to get my work in on time, or what you'd like me to do is empty the dishwasher when it's full, and you know, it gives you time, because all those kind of things, what somebody might have heard is, you know, you I want you to get your work in on time. They might have heard, you're bad at your job, you're useless, I don't think you're any good, rather than the person might just have been requesting, could you get it in a bit sooner? And there may have been criticism in there, but then if we're not receiving it as a negative, and therefore recognizing it as a request from the other, and that they would like us to make a behaviour change, it's a very different thing to, I'm a bad person, I'm not loved, which is often what's heard. Or if somebody says, could you empty the dishwasher when it's full, we could hear all manner of things like, you know, we're asked too much of, we don't pull our weight, all that we're not good enough, all manner of things, or we might be just pushing back against our mother or father. Whereas actually we go away from adult, when in an adult relationship, ideally people can talk together about what's needed without reactivity. But often people aren't really adults. They are carrying their wounded child with them. So they've grown up, but the wounded child's still there. So what's happening all the time is that there's a reactivity coming out of the child, and that's where so much conflict arises. And essentially it arises through a lack of validation of the other, and a lack of being able to cross the bridge into the world of the other and validate the differences that we have, and hear and understand them. So really and truly, in summary, one, it's growth wanting to happen. So any conflict, if we start to think that growth's wanting to happen, and two, if we think that we're responsible for our part, and that we move away from wanting the other to change, because that is one of the most common things that creates a spiral of it going wrong. And we are the only ones who can affect the change, and that actually, to empower ourselves, we have to stay in our center and be prepared to recognize that if we react, that's our responsibility, and that no one outside us can make us feel anything. Now, that doesn't mean that things aren't difficult and we wouldn't have to have difficult conversations and difficult negotiations with people, but ultimately, the more we are recognizing that what might have been touched is a place where we don't feel good enough, we don't feel we're heard, we don't feel we're seen, we don't feel understood, we don't feel loved. And of course, essentially, the work we need to do is to see ourselves, hear ourselves, understand ourselves, love ourselves. And the irony of this is, as we start to clear up these hurts within us, we will start to notice it, that it's all around us, that people do want to hear us or see us or listen to us, and we are loved. But essentially, any conflict, there is an opportunity for growth. If two people are in a conflict and they recognize that it's an opportunity, and they are able to press pause and say, let's stop this, and let's recognize that we now need to really hear one another, and therefore, if you can't do it immediately, say, okay, we'll go and we will reflect, clear some of the distressing energy that's come up into us, we'll regroup, we'll come back in an hour, and we'll be able to talk intentionally. And by intentionally, that would be one person talking and the other completely listening and checking they've heard what the person says, mirroring it back to them, and really committing to keep the space safe and not act out of any reactivity, even if it's arising in the body. And then really validating the other, because even if you don't actually really understand it, and it's not your range of experience what's going on, it is seeking to cross the bridge into the world of the other and really see it from their perspective, really get into their shoes, and things can be transformed, and there is a healing of both people when each person is seen, heard, listened to, validated, and incredible transformation can occur.